Okay, students. Okay, so for this topic, we will be talking about fallacies. All right. So this is part of critical thinking and logic. Okay. So the learning outcomes at the end of this lesson, you should be able to understand subject fallacies, define fallacies involving credibility, explain fallacies of context, then enumerate fallacies of logical structures. Okay. So in introduction of fallacies, no, it says that in the broadest sense of the term, a fallacy is any error in reasoning. So, but the term is normally restricted to certain patterns of errors that occur with some frequency, usually because the reasoning involved has a certain surface plausibility. So, to the unwary, the premises of fallacious arguments seem relevant to the conclusion. So, even though they are not, or the argument seems to have more strength than it actually does. So this is fallacies are committed with some frequency. So we are going to study fallacies now for two reasons. First is to help you avoid them in your own thinking and identify them when you are used against you or when they are used against you in debate. Forewarned is forearmed, right? So the second reason is that understanding why these patterns of the argument are fallacious will help us understand the nature of good reasoning. So just as doctors increase their understanding of health by studying diseases, we can gain clarity about good arguments by seeing what is wrong with bad ones. Okay, so subjectivist, all right? Subjectivist, okay. Um, okay. So for subjectivist, it is the cardinal virtue in reasoning, okay, is objectivity, or the cardinal virtue in reasoning is objectivity. So your commitment to thinking in accordance with the facts and interpreting them logically. So the fallacies we'll examine in the section involve the violation of objectivity in one way or another. So subjectivism, so the first and most straightforward violation of objectivity is the fallacy of subjectivism. So this fallacy is committed whenever we hold that something is true merely because we believe or we want it to be true. So thus, if P is the proposition in question, subjectivism has formed. Let's say, for example, I believe or I want P to be true. P is true. Okay. Is this something that urges to your mind that this is true or I want this to be true? Even if I'm not sure, but for me, I could believe that this one is true. Something like that. Okay. So in argument of this sort, so a subjective state, the mere fact that we have a belief or desire is being used as evidence for the truth of a proposition. But the thoughts and feelings that pass through our minds may or may not correspond to reality. So that's why we need a logical method of discovering whether they are true. That's why objectivity is a virtue in the first place, right? Okay. So the fact that someone prefaces a statement with words I think or I feel does not necessarily imply subjectivism. So this is conventional way of expressing a view. So and the person may go on to offer a perfectly objective argument, nor are statements about our thoughts and feelings necessarily subjective. So suppose I am trying to tell whether the emotion I am feeling is resentment or justifiable anger. So my thought process may be either objective or subjective. So objective if I am open to the evidence. Subjective if I decide that this is justifiable anger merely because I can't bear to think of myself as resentful. Okay, do you get the point? Okay? So, this is objective if I open to or I am open to the evidence or evidences. Okay? It will become subjective if I am the one decide that it is or this is justifiable anger. Okay? Because I can't bear to think of myself as resentful. Okay? Do you know what is subjectivism is? All right. So in other words, subjectivism is not an issue of what a statement or conclusion is about. So it is an issue of the kind of evidence one uses to support a conclusion. So the fallacy is committed only when someone uses the mere fact that he believes or feels something as a reason for thinking it to be true, right? So it is the same sense that you have a neighbor who were uh, found out or something like in jail for reason of stealing. Then when he bails, or when that person get bailed out, and then since he or she or he lives or stayed in your neighborhood, then something got missing in your place. So in the first place, your assumption is like maybe that person is the one made or is the one who stole your thing or belonging, something like that. But that's like that is a subjective uh thinking, right? So you don't have a solid evidence or concrete evidence to prove that this person is the one who stole your belonging. Okay? So if once you found out through the use of your evidences like CCTV or witnesses, then you can find out or you can conclude that this guy is the one who stole the thing. Okay? Something like that. All right, so appeal to majority. So people have criticized that Roman Catholic Church for opposing birth control measures, even though many Catholics do not believe birth control is wrong. So this criticism is an appeal to majority belief, so which is a fallacy for essentially the same reason that subjectivism is. So the argument has to form the majority of people, nations, etc. believe that P is true. Okay, so meaning to say that the concept that we have that God is true. There is no like how do you call that one? Solid evidence for this because no one saw the real God. Okay? So in our recent time, we cannot say that God is true because I saw him. Who will believe you? Right? But if we justify like based on the Bible, we can right I conclude that God is true. Through the goodness of God, I have this, I have like this, and I have this property of something. Then according to everybody who believes in the Bible, then or who believes not only in the Bible but also to the Holy Book. Okay? So Holy Book generalize the Bible, the Quran, and any other religious books. Okay? So if this concept will apply, then the the idea of the majority will be the basis, no, that this is a good or an evidence enough to justify that this statement is true. Okay, the idea about God is something illusionary, something that we believe that there is something even though we cannot see them. There is something beyond us even if we don't have enough evidence to prove that this um subjects or this how do you call that one, um higher or this one or this how do you call that one? I'm not sure the term, but yeah. So if this idea is true, that God is true, then based on the Bible, based on the majority, appeal to majority that this is true. Okay? So in this case, the subjective state or large numbers of people, not just a single person, is being used as evidence for the truth of proposition. But the argument is still subjective, all right? As I said, it is still subjective. It is still hanging. There's no solid evidence to prove that this idea is true. Okay? This is just only the idea of the majority that they confirm that this is actually real. Okay? It is something that there's an argument like the the baby is boy. The newborn baby is boy. So in the first place, if you cannot see the baby, no, physically, then you cannot sure, no, you cannot be sure if this is true or not. If that kid or baby is boy, right? Unless if you find out or you visit the boy and then see that yeah, it's a boy. Okay, so if you could just hear the idea from many people that they said that this baby is a boy. So even if like you cannot justify them or justify the fact that this baby is a boy, but according to them, the majority says that this baby is a boy. So maybe you can conclude, yeah, maybe that's true because according to them, they agreed. Okay, but this is still subjective unless if you get some sort of evidence to prove that this baby is a boy. How to find out? Okay, so like for example, when I was in college, that was mentioned that the baby doesn't have organ. So how to identify that this baby is boy or girl? Okay, so the other idea is let's find out once this baby will grow up. So we can just see that we can just identify or determine that this baby is a boy or girl, even though he or she doesn't have organ. So other explanation is we can just determine the baby or when he grows up or when he or she grows up, you can just determine them or that baby by seeing his or her um you know figure, no, if it is like not figure but the bones or something like that. So there is difference or distinction between the male and female actually for bones or the structure, right? So you can identify with that fact. But yeah, so in a short way here we can say that or we can prove that this something is true if once we have the hard evidence to prove. All right. Next, the fallacy of appeal to majority is committed whenever someone takes a proposition to be true merely because large numbers of people believe it. So regardless of whether those people actually constitute a majority. So this fallacy probably occurs more often in the political debate than in any other area. So one version is the argument from tradition. So it's an I oppose socialized medicine because it is inconsistent with our tradition of private medical practice. To say that principle or policy is traditional is merely to say that it was widely accepted by our predecessors. Okay, so the mere fact that they accepted it does not prove it correct. Another version of the fallacy might be called the way of the future. So argument. So every other progressive nation has already adopted a program of government provided healthcare. So the United States likewise should abandon its outmoded system of private medicine. To say that some principle or policy is the wave of the future is merely to say that many people or countries have already accepted it. So an appeal to their preferences in support of the principle or policy is once again an appeal to majority. So the only differ hence between this opposing arguments is that they appeal to different majorities. So the fact that such an appeal is fallacious doesn't mean we should ignore majority opinion. Objectivity requires willingness to consider the views of others. If large numbers of people have accepted the principle or policy, it may well be because the principle is true. The policy, a good one. Okay? So it may well be because the principle is true, the policy a good one. Okay? The possibility is certainly worth exploring. So when we explore it, however, we should look for objective evidence. So mere popularity doesn't count, right? So here is the appeal to emotion. So this fallacy is the attempt to persuade someone of a conclusion by an appeal to emotion instead of evidence. So person who commits this fallacy is hoping that his listeners will adopt a belief and the basis of a feeling he has instilled in them. So outrage, hostility, fear, pity, guilt, or whatever. So in effect, he is hoping that they will commit the fallacy of subjectivism. So the appeal to emotion may be quite explicit. More often, however, the appeal is less direct. Okay, it may take the form of rhetorical language that is heavily laden with emotive connotations, as in propaganda and other sorts of incendiary political speech. The fallacy may also take the form of visual images that have a strong emotional impact. On television, for example, you can find examples of fallacy not only in the advertising or advertisement, but also in news and documentary programs that use images to sway the viewer, right? Okay. So let's say, for example, you encounter a person who is keep on saying that he's hungry. Okay. Or let's say you can encounter a person who's wearing a very poor how do you call that one? Um dress or something like that. Okay. So his t-shirt is something like uh, dirty or yeah, something like that. And then can you judge or another thing is, hold on, so I'm sorry. So another thing is like a person who were judged by a, how do you call that one, an executive seller or something like that, or dealer. Okay, so that guy went to the store or auto shop. Okay, so he went there and just like visiting the cars in there displayed in the store. All right. So the guard did not allow him to get in, to go inside. It's because of his attire, right? So it seems that he doesn't have money or something, that he's dirty or something like that. The guard just the security guard judged him by his appearance. Okay. But something like is new about that person. He's wearing a bad attire, but he has a lot of money to buy the vehicle he wants, or he wanted to. Okay. So there's sometimes that appeal to emotion is somehow like dangerous. Okay. So we cannot just easily judge a person by its appearance or by its posture. It's because we don't know the real story behind. Okay. Like for example, an old guy asking for money. Would you think that this is necessary the way of life he has? No, it's not, right? So it's not, because sometimes they just only show themselves. That's like pretending or something like that. Okay, so this is actually the sometimes it's very dangerous as well. So that's that we need to examine if the emotion, or if that gesture of the person is true or not. Okay, so the rhetoric and other emotive devices are not fallacies per se if you have a logical argument to back up a conclusion. So there is nothing wrong with stating it in such a way that your audience will endorse it with their feelings as well as their intellects. So good writers and speakers combine logic and rhetoric to produce exactly that effect. So even in advertising, the emotional pitch may be accompanied by a bona fide reason to buy the product. So the fallacy occurs only when rhetoric replaces logic, only when the intent is to make an audience act on emotion instead of rational judgment. Okay, so next is fallacies involving credibility. So we notice at the beginning of the chapter that we rely on information based on by other people. For much of what we know, most of us lack first-hand knowledge of the evidence for the theory of relativity. So the DNA model of genes, the link between smoking and the lung cancer, we accept this and other scientific ideas because we accept the authority of experts in the various fields. We know about historical events largely through the records and memories left by our predecessors. We learn about current events from reading newspapers, account by the journalist. Courts of law rely on eyewitness testimony and expert witnesses. So indeed, we can extend the legal concept of testimonial evidence to cover all of these cases. Okay, so to evaluate such evidence, we must weigh the credibility of the witness. When we accept the conclusion on the basis of someone's testimony, our reasoning can be diagrammed as follows. X says P. P is true. Okay? So X says P, then P is true. So if such an argument is to have any strength or gravity, okay, so assumptions must be true. So first, X must be competent to speak on the subject. So if P is a statement in some technical area, then X must have some expertise in that area. So if it is a statement about some event, X must be someone who was in a position to know what happened. Second, X must be reporting what he knows objectively without distortion or deceit. In other words, X must be someone who not only knows the truth, but who also tells the truth. Both conditions are essential for credibility. Ideally, we should have a positive reason to think that X is competent and objective. At the very least, we must not have an evidence that X is incompetent or non-objective. All right? Okay. So, an appeal to authority, this is argumentum ad vericondium. Okay? So, okay, appeal to authority. So, an authority, okay, hold on. for a while. So appeal to authority. Actually, there is also an appeal to force. Okay, not just only appeal to. Okay, so I will include this one, appeal to force, or this is what they called as argumentum ad baculum. Okay, so argumentum ad baculum is hold on. So it is an appeal to force may will involve direct coercion. Okay. So when a government engages in censorship, now for example, it uses forces to prohibit the expression of certain ideas and to compel agreement with other ideas. No? So the point of this control or over verbal expression is to influence what people believe. So, but the fallacy need nor involve actual physical force or violence. So it is committed whenever any sort of threat is used. And non-physical threats no, are probably more common than physical ones. So when parents threaten to withdraw their support unless a child adopts their religious beliefs, when a teacher threatens a dissenting student with a lower grade, when someone persuades a friend by threatening the loss of affection. So they are committing forms of this fallacy. Okay? So as the example illustrate, the fallacy is usually committed in the effort to breed conformity and belief. So, and the society has many non-physical means of intimidating people into accepting the conventional views. So the centers may be held up to ridicule. Okay, so threatened with moral disapproval or yeah, so told they aren't cool or something and so on. So whenever intimidation of this sort replaces logic, no, in effort to persuade. So it is no less fallacious than the use of actual force. Okay, so in summary of the subjectivism, no, subjectivism using the fact that one believes or wants a proposition to be true as evidence of its truth. Okay? So for appeal to majority, it is using the fact that large numbers of people believe a proposition to be true as evidence of its truth. Then appeal to emotion or argumentum ad populum, it is trying to get someone to accept a proposition on the basis of an emotion one elicits. Then appeal to force, it's argumentum ad baculum, it's trying to get someone to accept a proposition on the basis of threat. Okay, so now fallacies involving credibility. The argumentum ad vericondium, so it is uh, an authority is someone, okay, an authority is someone whose words carry special weight. So someone who can speak with authority because of expertise in some area of knowledge such as law, science, or medicine. So it is perfectly appropriate to rely on the testimony of authorities of the conditions of credibility are satisfied. So if they are not satisfied, however, the appeal to authority is fallacious. Okay? Next is, okay, before that, okay, before we proceed to ad hominem, the first condition is that the alleged authority be competent. So an expert, the expert on the subject matter in question. So it is typically violated when people speak outside their fields of expertise. So for example, advertisers often use celebrity endorsements. Okay? Or a basketball star praises his favorite brand of orange juice. Or like, for example, a famous actor extols the virtues of a luxury car. Or if the role of the celebrity is merely to add glamour, okay, there's no fallacy involved. So because there's no attempt to at logical argument. So but the advertiser's point is usually to persuade you that the product is good because someone you respect says so. Okay? That's a fallacy. Right? So skill in the basketball court does not imply a discriminating taste in orange juice, nor does acting ability give an expertise in judging cars. When people of talent or expertise speak on matters outside their fields, their opinion carries no more weight than that of any layman. Okay? So, okay. Okay, next is the ad hominem. Okay? So ad hominem is argument rejects of dismisses no another person's statement by attacking the person rather than the statement of itself. So as we will see, There are many different forms of this fallacy. So, but all of them involve some attempts to avoid dealing with statement logically. Okay, so and in each case, the method is to attempt the discredit, no, or discredit the speaker by citing some native trait. Okay, an ad hominem argument has the form of x says p plus x has some negative trait, then P is false. Okay? All right. So this fallacy, or this is a fallacy because the truth or falsity of the statement itself, or the strength of an argument for it, has nothing to do with the character, motives, or any other trait of the person who makes the statement or argument. So this principle is true even if when we are concerned with testimonial evidence, we have to keep a certain distinction in mind. So if some defends a position by citing an authority, as we have seen, then it's legitimate to consider evidence regarding the authority's competence and objectivity. So when a jury is asked to accept the testimony of a witness, it is certainly legitimate for the opposing side to introduce evidences that the witness is dishonest or biased. Okay? But discrediting witnesses or authorities does not provide evidence that what they say is actually false. It merely eliminates any reason for thinking that what they say is true. So we go back to square one. So we are left with no evidence one way or the other. In other contexts, where there is no issue of relying on authorities, the use of discrediting evidence about the person is always fallacious. So if someone offers an argument for his position, then his character and motives does not matter. So we have to evaluate the argument on its metrics. Okay? Okay, later na to. Okay. So, uh, in its crudest form, the ad hominem fallacy involves nothing more than insults, no? Calling one's opponent an idiot, right? Slob, lowlife, airhead, faces, pinkor, nerd, fairy, bleeding, or whatever, so on. So through the rich vocabulary of abuse, no, our language offers. Unlike the other fallacies, moreover, this one is committed fairly often and it's crude for. Okay, in personal disputes, disagreement often breed anger. So an angry people hit below the belt. So in politics, ad hominem arguments are a common technique, no, of propaganda. Okay, take note. So in politics, ad hominem arguments are a common technique of propaganda and a common device for of politicians who try to enlist support by attacking their enemies. But the fallacy can also take more sophisticated forms. So let's look at a few. Okay, so suppose that someone criticizes you for telling a white lie. If you critic Okay, if your critic is himself a notorious liar, you would probably be tempted to say, look who's talking. This response is certainly understandable. No one enjoys being censored by a mortal inferior, but it is fallacious. It's a pieces of ad hominem known that as the tu quoque, or you're another argument. Okay, so the fact that someone else is guilty of an accusation doesn't prove that you are innocent. So it may be unseemly for the court to call that Critel black, or but the Critel is black nonetheless, or let's say for example like that. Okay, so next is okay. So for ad hominem, no, in addition, ad hominem using a negative trait of a speaker as evidence that his statement is false or his argument is weak. Okay. So next is fallacies of context. Okay. So fallacies is in this category include arguments that jumps to conclusion. So although some of the fallacies can be cast in the form of deductive arguments. So what makes them fallacious is a weak inductive components. So as we know, or as we saw in the previous chapter, the logical strength of an inductive argument is a matter of degree. So depending on how thoroughly we have taken account of the factors relevant to the conclusion. So the fallacies in this section is all involved a significant logical gap. So because they fail to consider a wide enough context of relevant information. So the problem is not the premise per se, unlike the subjectivist fallacy. So the premise of this argument do provide genuine evidence. So but the evidence is simply inadequate or incomplete in a way that the argument overlooks. We could just treat such argument as weak, but the patterns of argument we're going to study in this section have features that make them appear to be stronger than they actually are. So as with other kinds of fallacy, learning to see past the appearance will help us avoid poor reasoning. Okay? All right. So next is false alternative. Okay? So false alternative, suppose you tell me that Diane is not rich and I infer that she is poor. I have obviously failed to take into account of other alternatives. Rich and poor are extremes, and on a scale that contains many intermediate degrees of wealth. So again, suppose you say that you do not identify with political conservatives, and I infer that you are a liberal. I am ignoring that the political positions that you might hold, along with the possibility that you have not adopted any position. Such inferences have a general form like either P or Q plus not Q, then P. So that is a deductive or deductively valid form of argument. But the soundness of any such inference depends on whether the premise takes account of all the relevant alternatives. So the fallacy of false alternatives occurs when we fail to do so, when we exclude relevant alternative without justification. Okay, so right. So this assumption ignores other possibilities such as discussing the problem with you know with the colleagues, no, or seeking the therapy or whatnot. Okay, so okay. Next is the post hoc. Okay, so the Latin name of this fallacy is short for post hoc ergo propter hoc. Okay, after this, therefore, because of this. Okay, this is what it means. So the fallacy has to do with causality, and it has the structure. A occurred before B. Then A caused B. Okay, what is causality again? The cause and effect, right? So such reasoning is fallacious because many events that precede a given event have nothing to do with it. So as in the old joke, why are you whistling? To keep the elephants away. But there aren't any elephants around. Here, see, it works. Okay. Okay, so the post hoc, okay, fallacy is probably the source of many superstitions. So someone somewhere we had a run of bad luck and attributed it to breaking a mirror, walking under a ladder, stepping in the crack, or some other previous action. So a student does well in an exam and thereafter always wears the same lucky sweater on exam days. So more serious examples of the fallacy occur in situations where causal relationships are extremely complex and difficult to identify. So stock market advisors, for instance, sometimes make predictions on the basis of a few indicators that happen to precede a previous rise or fall in prices. Post hoc reasoning can also occur in speculation about the causes of historical events such as civil war, the causes of economic phenomena such as Great Depression, or causes of sociological trends such as crime rates. Okay, all right. Okay. So it is certainly true that if you want to know what caused an event or phenomenon, B, we have to start by identifying the factors that preceded it. So, but we can't stop there. So to show that some particular factors away or A was the cause, we have to find evidence that there is some stronger connection between A and B than just a temporal relationships. So when we study inductive reasoning, we will study in detail the types of argument that provide such evidence. Okay, so for now, no, we will have to rely on our intuitive judgment. Okay, when someone presents an argument that A caused B, ask yourself. Okay, so yeah, Next is the fallacies of logical structure. Okay, but there is still okay, I would include this one, the hasty generalization. So what is hasty generalization? So it is general propositions are normally supported by observing a sample of particular cases. No, we often draw a conclusion too quickly. So on the basis of insufficient evidence, this fallacy, known as the hasty generalization, can take many forms. Okay, a single bad experience while traveling can prejudice our view of an entire city or country. Okay, so yeah, so that is hasty generalization. Then there is an accident as well. So hasty generalization is a fallacy that can occur in moving from particular case to a generalization. So there is a fallacy called accident. So that can occur when we move an opposite direction by applying a generalization to a particular case. So this fallacy consists in applying a generalization to a special case without regard to the circumstances that make the case an exemption or an exception to the present or the general rule. Okay, accident is the fallacy of hasty application. Okay, okay, there is also the slippery slope. Okay, so um okay, anyway, no, we will just talk the important one, like composition and division. So the composition of and division, so this is the fallacy of composition, consists of inferring that what is true or of a part must be true of the whole. So of course, now parts and whole sometimes do have the same properties. So every page in a newspaper has a flammable, and so it's a newspaper as a whole, but not every property is like this. We commit the fallacy of composition when we jump to a conclusion about the whole without considering whether the nature of the property in question makes it reasonable. So the ratio in my car was made by Motorola, but that does not imply that Motorola made my car as a whole. So every snowflakes on my lawn is star shaped and fell from the sky. So but the snowball I make has neither of those properties. So the fallacy of division is the mirror image of composition. So it is the inference that what is true of the whole must be true of the parts. So that fact, or the fact that my car gets 25 miles to the gallon does not mean that the radio gets 25 miles to the gallon. So a statement that hardly even makes sense. So the fact that my car was made by General Motors does not mean that General Motors made every part. All right, so that is how you're gonna analyze the composition and division. All right, so next is fallacies of logical structure. Okay, so in previous sections, we examine arguments that are fallacious either because they introduce irrelevant consideration into the reasoning process, okay, emotion, threats, personal traits, or because they fail to consider a wide enough context of information. So in this section, we'll examine fallacies that involve more subtle logical errors within the argument itself. So beginning the question, okay, so that is circular argument. So begging the question is the use of proposition as a premise in an argument intended to support the same proposition. So the point of reasoning as it is to throw light on the truth of falsity or of a proposition or the conclusion. So by relating it to other proposition, the premises that we already have some basis for believing to be true. So if our reasoning does nothing more than relate P to itself, then it hasn't gained us anything. So it has not given us a reason to think P is true. Circular arguments are no more productive than circular definitions. So the most obvious way to commit the fallacy would be simply to restate the conclusion as a premise. No, in an argument of the form P, then P. Okay. Okay. No. Right. So we still have we are still in okay. So this usually, okay, again, an argument of the form P then P. So this usually occurs only when the proposition is formulated in two different ways, so that it is an immediately apparent that the person is simply restating the conclusion. For example, society has an obligation to support the needy because people who cannot provide for themselves have a right to the resources of the community. Statement number 2 expresses same proposition as 1. Society means the same thing as community. The needy are the same class of people as those who cannot provide for themselves. And the obligation mentioned in 1 is merely another way of expressing the right mentioned in 2. So both statements, therefore, should be given the same number, and the diagram would be 1, then 1. So people typically beg the question in this way when a proposition seems so obvious, not to them, that they aren't sure what further evidence could be given for it. So they keep restating it in the hope that some formulation will strike the listener as plausible and lead him to agree. Okay, so a more subtle form of the fallacy occurs when the circle is enlarged to include more than one step. So the conclusion P is supported by premise Q, which in run is supported by Q. So though there could be any number of intervening steps. So suppose I am arguing with an atheist about the existence of a supreme being. He asks why I believe that God exists and say, because the Bible says so. So if then ask why, he should take the Bible's word for it. And I answer that the Bible is trustworthy because it is the word of God. So I am arguing in a circle. My premise assumes that the existence of God, which was precisely the question at issue. So at this example illustrates circular reasoning of this type often occurs in debates when we try to answer an objections by falling back on the conclusion we are trying to establish. Okay, so an indirect form of begging the question is known as the complex question or loaded question. So suppose I accuse you of having cheated on the test, and when you deny it, I say, why are you lying to me? So any answer you give will imply that you were indeedly lying, and thus what you did cheat. So the reason for this is obvious. Despite its appearance, the question is not simple but complex. It is loaded with an implicit emotion or some assumption, rather, not emotion, but it is assumption. So there are really two questions here. So are you lying? And if so, why? Okay, we can even raise the second question, must less answer it. Okay, until we have answered the first one. So by not asking the first question, I have simply assumed that the answer of it to it is yes. I have begged the question. Strictly speaking, it is not the question itself. Why are you lying? So that is fallacious. Okay, a question is not assertion or an argument. So but such question rests on certain assumptions. So in asking the question, I am implicitly asserted that you did lie. Okay, so I am thus assuming that very thing I need to prove. Okay, so next for this is, okay, so I will also include the equivocation. Actually, there is equivocation, but I did not include it into the slide. Okay, so equivocation is, we have seen that an argument links one or more propositions used a premise with a proposition that serve as the conclusions. We have also seen that what a proposition asserts depends, or in part. So in other words, used to express it. So the fallacy of equivocation occurs when a word switches meanings in the middle of the argument. Okay, have you tried this one? Right? So when you are talking about that thing and then the argument switches into different term that might be strange to you, then that's what we call as equivocation. Okay, so yeah, okay, so when it expresses one concept to one premise and another concept in one premise or in the conclusion. So consider the following argument. Let's say, for example, grades are a crude and mechanical device that does not measure the nuance of student performance, then students should not be graded. Okay, again, so this is the argument. Okay, grades are a crude and mechanical device that does not measure the nuances of student performance. Then student work should not be graded. Okay, so the conclusion is not supported by the premise because the term grade has shifted its meaning. Okay, yeah. So the claim that letter grades are a poor evaluation of evaluation device hardly implies that student work should not be evaluated at all. So if anything, it implies that we should find a better means of measuring performance. So in this example, the equivocation occurred because a word was used in both a narrower sense to designate a species, letter grades, okay, and in a wider sense to designate a genus, okay. So this illustrates a common pattern in which a word's meaning is broadened in the course of an argument, okay. All right, so next is argument appeal to ignorance. It is argumentum ad ignorantiam. Okay? So argumentum ad ignorantiam, suppose I claim that, okay? Okay, suppose I claim that politician X is having an affair with an aide. So prove it. You say, can you prove that he's not having an affair? So I ask, and thereby commit the fallacy of appeal to ignorance. This fallacy consists an argument that a proposition is true because it hasn't been proven false. So to put it differently, it is the argument that a proposition is true because the opposing proposition hasn't been proven true. So using a symbol P to stand the denial or negotiation or negation of P. So the fallacy has the structure. Okay? Negative P has not been proven true, but then P is true. Okay? All right. So this fallacy, or this is the fallacy because a lack of evidence for P does not imply that there is evidence for P. Okay? All it means is that we do not know that P is true. So I can prove that a storm is not brewing in the atmosphere of Jupiter, but that would hardly count as evidence that a storm is brewing. The absence of evidence usually means that we simply don't know enough to make a judgment. Such ignorance cannot be transmuted into knowledge any more than brass can be transmuted into gold, right? So in the preceding examples of fallacy, the proposition P was a positive claim. So that X is having an affair, that the storms is brewing on Jupiter. But the fallacy can also be committed when P is negative claim. The absence of evidence that X is having an affair but does not prove that he isn't or he isn't or he is not. The absence of evidence that a storm is brewing doesn't prove that one is not or one isn't. In the diagram above, no, P may be either negative or positive, and negative P will have the opposite quality. So the structure of the fallacy is the same in either case. Strictly speaking, there is a logical symmetry between positive and negative claims. So in practice, however, the fallacy is normally committed by those who assert that was positive. The reason is that we rarely have occasion to assert that something is not the case until some has suggested that it is. So suppose I like suddenly announce that there is an invisible how do you call that one? Invisible thing or something like that. So if you have over your left shoulder, okay, or hovering over your left shoulder. So we couldn't settle the matter by looking, since I said it was invisible, right? So I'm the one making the assertion here. So I have to provide evidence. Apart from my statement, it would never occur to you, no, to deny that there is an invisible thing over your left shoulder. Okay? So as a rule, it is the positive claim that puts the something, that something in play, and the positive claim that carries an essential border of proof. So if someone makes an unsupported statement, therefore, the proper response is not to make an equally or to make an equally unsupported denial. So nor should you accept the burden of disapproving the person's statement. So if you do, um, you are cooperating in an implicit appeal to ignorance. Okay, so this is a trap that paranoid people often spring in the listeners. Okay, to make their arbitrary claim that about the conspiracy against them, and then take claim to be vindicated unless others can disapprove it. Okay, then the last fallacy is the diversion. Yeah, is this the last one? Yeah, the diversion. Okay, so I did not include this. So the fallacy of diversion consists in changing the issue in the middle of an argument. So prosecutor in a child abuse case might go on about the owners of child abuse, the child suffering in the future psychological problems, statistics showing that the problem is growing one, and so forth, when the real issue is whether the defendant is guilty of the crime. So the argument would run. So the defendant is guilty of child abuse. Child abuse is an unlawful or an awful crime. Then statements concerning immediate and long-term effects on children, statistics and the extent of the problem, and other evidences. Okay, so the prosecutor's strategy is obvious. Now he is diverting attention from one to two, no, because two is much easier to prove. So who could deny that child abuse is awful? So at the same time, however, he is hoping that the jury will not notice the diversion and that the strength of the argument for conclusion too. So will carry over their mind too. Okay. So even though the defendant's guilt is a completely separate question, as the example illustrates, diversion often works hand in glove with appeal to emotion. Okay, diversion works best when the non-relevant conclusion arouses powerful emotions. Okay, for this reason, now a non-relative issue is sometimes called a red herring. Okay, or red herring. Okay, herring turns red when it is smoked, and a smoked fish has such a powerful smell, dragging it across the ground will through a dog off the scent. Okay, so a common form of diversion occurs in regards to human actions and their consequences. Virtually any action has some effects that are not intended and often not even foreseen. The fact that your action had a certain consequence, therefore, does not necessarily mean that you intended it. Okay, so does does not necessarily mean that you intended it. And I would commit the fallacy of diversion if I try to prove your intent solely by showing that the action did have that consequences. Okay? All right. So, yeah, that's the last one. So, I hope, okay, so if you have question or clarification about this topic, you can just leave a message in our in the comment below. Okay? So, thank you for listening. So, okay, we will have more examples for this fallacies, but later on, okay, during our next session. Okay, so thank you for your time and have a nice day.